Hi everyone. This is Jewish history class at Flagler College. Uh, Today we're going to be talking about Jews in the United States from the beginning, really, of the settlement and colonization of the Americas up to the Second World War, and the number of interesting developments, of course, during that time. I am not primarily a historian of America, or really not in any way a historian of America, but this does touch on some of the themes that we have discussed already, and in some ways there are a lot of parallels between the experience of Jews in Europe and the experience of Jews in the United States, especially when it comes to kind of major historical trends that they're part of. So hopefully you'll notice that. One of the things we should say about the United States is that, well, two things actually. The United States provides, in many ways, a kind of haven for Jews who had, as we've discussed, been persecuted for much of European history, and increasingly, at least from the 18th century on, in the Middle East, in the Ottoman Empire. But from its foundation as a republic, the United States granted religious liberty, and this was extended to Jews, and the founding fathers were actually quite purposeful about this. And for the most part, that's been taken seriously. Now, that doesn't mean that anti-Semitism hasn't reared its ugly head in American history, but Jews have been able to live, for the most part, able to exercise their freedom of religion without any sort of molestation. And this is also, by that token, this is a place, the United States, where Jews have seen some of the greatest challenges to the sort of religious character of Judaism, given that Jews see themselves theologically, at least one perspective of Judaism, the Orthodox perspective, sees the Jews as not just a religion, but as a people, as a nation, even as a group who are favored of God and who have a land that will be restored to them. Well, the American identity in many ways challenges that, and frankly, the secular culture of America challenges Jews in ways that don't exist, at least not to that level, anywhere else, right? So there are many opportunities in the United States, but also we might say many temptations to compromise Jewish identity. So those are some of the themes we'll be looking at here. The other main point, sort of before we begin, is that the United States, at least from the late 19th century on, offers or becomes home to the largest Jewish community in the world. And this remains so all the way to the present, although the modern state of Israel has begun to rival that in terms of numbers in the second half of the 20th century and in the beginning of the 21st century. And so, that's something else we need to be aware of, is that the demographics of modern Judaism tilt largely toward the United States of America, and this is in part because of the Holocaust, which we'll talk about next week, and the massive destruction of huge numbers of Jews that take place at that point, and really the destruction of European Jewry in general. The community of Jews in the United States becomes easily the most important community of Jews in the world, at least prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. Okay, the origins of Jews in America. Traditionally, and in terms of solid evidence, the first Jewish community in in what becomes the United States is in New Amsterdam, which of course becomes New York, in 1654. A group of Sephardic Jewish refugees fleeing the persecution of the Inquisition not in Spain or Portugal, but in Brazil, Recife, Brazil specifically, makes its way to New Amsterdam and sets itself up there, establishes a synagogue, which remains the only synagogue in operation in, again, what becomes the United States until the beginning of the 19th century. But there is some compelling evidence, and given that we are at Flagler College and this is in St. Augustine, Florida, there is some compelling evidence that suggests that a group of crypto Jews may have come, or I shouldn't say a group, that a number of crypto Jews may have come with Pedro Menendez, who, of course, founded St. Augustine in 1565. The wife of Pedro Menendez herself has a surname that was sort of quintessentially crypto-Jewish. Now, if we recall, the crypto-Jews were those who converted to Christianity under the pressure of the Inquisition and the expulsion from Spain at the end of the 15th century, but retained their sort of Jewish character, even if only in private. So the wife of Pedro Menendez had a surname that was often associated, or that was found among these crypto Jews. There's a couple of other pieces of evidence. Some of the burial practices of the early community in St. Augustine suggest Jewish burial practices. There's even the possibility that Pedro Menendez may have waited. He sailed into the intercoastal at St. Augustine, and may have waited a few days, possibly because he wanted Yom Kippur to pass, maybe because he himself or some of his crew were practicing the rituals associated with Yom Kippur. So again, a set of compelling evidence. The Jewish Historical Society of St. Augustine itself was largely founded based on an interest in this history, though they have branched out into other things. But the members of that, and I've been associated with this group a little bit. They have compiled a fairly impressive array of evidence to suggest the presence of crypto Jews here. Another place that has an early Jewish community as of the mid 18th century was Newport, Rhode Island. And there was a synagogue built there in 1763, which, and I said earlier that there was the only synagogue operating until the early 19th century was the one in New York, but that was the first in New York. That was the only one in New York itself, I should say, not in the whole of the United States. But there is a synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, built in 1763, and that's actually still there. It's a national monument today. But that community is kind of on again, off again. It flourishes for a time, then the Jews seem to immigrate to other places. By the American Revolution, 1770s, 1780s, there are about 2,000 Jews, most of them Ashkenazic, but Sephardic in culture. It's a Sephardic. I mean, the origins in Sepharad. The American Jews sort of retain that culture, and that lends itself to the kind of the character of the Jewish community up to that point. Now, I said at the beginning, but let me underscore this point, that the founding documents of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, for instance, but more specifically the Bill of Rights, especially the First Amendment, guarantees freedom of religion. Some of the founding fathers wrote explicitly about freedom of religion being extended to Jews specifically. Benjamin Franklin was known for his kind of ecumenical attitudes. Thomas Jefferson wrote explicitly about this, and he was informed a lot by the Enlightenment thinkers' discussion of religious toleration, John Locke and Voltaire and others. And maybe most importantly, there was no religious test required for holding public office, and so Jews, even in the fairly early stages of the Republic, are already becoming active politically and seeking political office. This is unique at this point in all of the world, right? The Jews are uh, not held up to any specific standard that is different from other citizens of the United States. And the Jews respond in kind by really embracing this notion of Judaism as a religion, not as a separate or special people necessarily, though that isn't entirely voided from the Jewish identity. But this is where the Jews really embrace this notion that Judaism is a religion, and that Jews can be good Americans, maybe even Americans first and Jews second. Now, the Jewish community remained small until the 1830s, when large numbers of Jews begin to immigrate from Germany. And for about 20 years, from the 1830s into the 1850s, and there's a fairly large influx after the aborted 1848 revolutions, for instance, in Europe. Many Jews end up immigrating to the United States. These Jews were less acculturated, and they tended to congregate in communities, most especially in New York City, where the Lower East Side of Manhattan became sort of the quintessential Jewish neighborhood in the United States of America. That doesn't mean that all the Jews in America lived there, but that whole area of Manhattan became almost entirely Jewish, and has retained a kind of Jewish character, even if that's only more of a stereotype than anything, all the way to the present. Many of these Jewish immigrants from Germany brought with them the skills that they had been using in their professional lives in Europe, especially their mercantile skills. Jewish peddlers. It's kind of a European stereotype, but there's a reality behind the stereotype. The Jews were often forced into these kind of retail occupations. The Jewish peddler with his cart, again, a fairly common image. Well, these are the Jews who were immigrating to the United States, and they took up doing what they were accustomed to doing. This isn't all of them. I mean, Jews ended up immigrating all over the United States. There we find Jewish gold prospectors in California in the late 1840s and early 1850s. We find Jews immigrating to places like Chicago and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Cincinnati. These all become important centers for, or rather, come to have fairly large Jewish communities in them. But many go to work in sort of the mercantile trade, to the point that by the Civil War era or just after it, Jews are the primary drivers of the trend towards creating department stores. The first department stores in the United States appear in the first half of the 19th century, largely through people of English origin, but quickly by the mid-19th century, more and more department stores are being opened by Jews. A good example of this is what is first called Wechsler and Abraham, but eventually becomes called Abraham and Strauss. And you can see the fashion catalog here on the slide from 1886. The building that you see portrayed on the cover of the catalog here, and then you can see actually they're trying to depict some of the interior of this same building. This became, and this is in Manhattan, this is in Brooklyn, so it's called the Mecca of Long Island. This store, and to call it a store is really kind of an understatement. It was almost a whole planet under one roof eventually. It's fascinating if you Google Abraham and Strauss building, and there are look up images of it. You can see that eventually this thing occupies an entire city block in Brooklyn. This is the storefront from the late 19th century, but they build on a new section of it right at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's like 6 or 7 stories high, and it's all under a big glass dome. And it was an absolutely massive department store, and it's it retains that character, kind of it's a destination. Like if you visit New York City, you got to go to Abraham and Straus and go shopping there. Abraham and Straus eventually bought out by another company. I forget. Oh, it's bought out by Macy's eventually. That's what it is. But this was a retail mecca. I mean, that description on the catalog is accurate. The Abraham, the founding partner's name was Abraham, which I find interesting. But in any case, I mean, by the late 19th century, 3/4 of all the department stores in the United States were owned by Jews. Now, religiously, or in terms of the development of kind of the religious leadership, from the mid 19th century on, the German origin Jews, and this is by far the majority of all Jews, were reform in character, very reform actually. And this is where the unique culture of the United States of America really sort of impinges on the character of Judaism in the United States. The Jews tend to acculturate a lot. The Reformed Jews in America, their rituals, their religious services mimic what they're seeing in Protestant Christian circles. The elimination of the separation of the sexes, things like congregational singing accompanied by an organ, even and maybe most especially the use of the English language, of course being the common vernacular in the United States, in the services, although they do continue to use Hebrew for the reading of the sacred texts. But sermons are given by rabbis in English. All of these trends that we talked about in the kind of Central European setting are pushed to an even greater degree in the United States. And we could identify a number of figures involved in this, but there is not one, I think, more important than Isaac Meyer Wise, who becomes, and his dates are roughly 1820, I think he's born in 1819 actually, to 1900, just to give you some sense of the chronology here. He becomes the chief rabbi of the largest synagogue, I think maybe the only synagogue at this point, in Cincinnati. And he ends up founding a newspaper and writing extensively about Judaism. And later in his career, when he's in his 50s, he becomes the founder of this organization called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. And that is followed by the establishment of a university, or rather it's a seminary initially, and it later becomes I think it's still mostly a seminary, but it's really kind of a university now, called Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, which is founded in 1875. And this really becomes the leading institution for all of Reform Judaism in the United States, and it remains, frankly, that all the way to the present. So there's a great deal of centralization of American Reform Judaism pushed by Isaac Meyer Wise, and he is the one arguing in large part for this Jews to see Judaism as their religious identity, but to acculturate, to be good Americans. And Wise is involved in this general trend in the United States where Jews use their religion as a way to kind of fight for social justice. Now, Wise does chart a somewhat moderate stance compared to some other Reform rabbis. For instance, the chief rabbi of Baltimore, David Einhorn, is pushing even more this notion of Judaism as a force for social justice. Einhorn becomes an outspoken abolitionist before the Civil War. And he's not the only one. There's another rabbi in Philadelphia named Sabato Marias, who I'll talk about in a minute here, is really one of the kind of founders of conservative Judaism. But he's pushing even harder to encourage Reform Jews to, use their religious identity as a way to fight for the rights of people, to confront the issues of modernity, and really not to worry at all, even to disregard many of the traditional tenets of Judaism, things like the kosher laws, eating kosher foods, ideas about the coming of the Messiah, the return to the Holy Land, the return to Palestine, all of that, right? Einhorn is a figure who's trying to reject all of that. And this is going to culminate in something called the Pittsburgh Platform in 1885. And I'll talk about that in a second here. But it should be said that there is also Orthodox opposition to this, that there are a number of Orthodox rabbis. Isaac Leeser is one, for instance, and I believe he's in New York. I can't remember, though, exactly. Where they continue to insist that these Reform rabbis are going too far, that Jews should embrace their kind of national identity, their identity as a special chosen people of God, and the awaiting of the coming of the Messiah, and the return to Israel, and all of that, right? So, I mean, not all Jews are Reformed. There are some who retain their Orthodox identity, but Reform is definitely the trend. I wanted to take a look quickly at the Pittsburgh Platform. This is part of a conference that was, as the website here says, this is the Jewish Virtual Library, which is a really wonderful website. But as noted here, this is a conference that is convened in 1885. Isaac Meyer Wise was the chair of this whole thing. And they come up with 8 sort of declarations as part of this platform. And I mean, it would be, I think, interesting to take a look at all of these, but I don't necessarily want to cover this exhaustively, right? So in the first one he says, or I shouldn't say he, Wise is the one kind of driving this, but he's not the only voice. We recognize in every religion an attempt to grasp the infinite. And so there's a respect for all religions, right? And that God is working with all people. So there's a very kind of ecumenical character to this whole thing. That the Bible shows that the Jewish people have been trying to represent God's will to people, and that they are a force for good all over the world, that they are a manifestation of the divine providence and justice of God. Right, and that the Mosaic legislation, that is the law of Moses, help Jews to understand their moral character. Okay, but then there were things added to this. Right, we reject, and this is a bad transcription of this, I guess. But so we accept as binding only its moral laws. But we reject such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization, as, for instance, those that regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress, and things like this, right? So we don't have to eat kosher food anymore. We don't need to maintain certain standards for the rabbis, right? That these are, meaning the sorts of very strict guidelines laid out for the priests in the Torah is what they're talking about here. These are, well, they're apt rather to obstruct than to further modern spiritual elevation, right? And look at number 6 here. We recognize in Judaism a progressive religion, ever striving to be in accord with the postulates of reason. This, of course, is the legacy of the Enlightenment, right? So we need to retain our Jewish identity because we have always been, functioning according to the dictates of reason, and we have influenced even other religions, including Christianity and Islam, which are daughter religions of Judaism, that they got their ideas about moral truth from Judaism. So, this is the origin, right? And so it's special in that regard. We reassert that the soul is immortal, okay, but we reject as ideas not rooted in Judaism the beliefs both in bodily resurrection and in Gehenna and Eden, that is hell and paradise, as abodes for everlasting punishment and reward. So there's a very, very much in the Pittsburgh platform in particular a this worldly perspective of Judaism, right? That, and they're not rejecting, this is not clear in the Hebrew Bible, but it is clear in some of the traditional rabbis, especially Maimonides, who opined as part of a kind of Jewish creed that there is a bodily resurrection, right? And this last one is maybe the best statement of Judaism as a force for social justice, and that ought to be the primary nature of the Jewish religion, in full accordance with the spirit of the Mosaic legislation, which strives to regulate the relations between rich and poor. We deem it our duty to participate in the great task of modern times, to solve on the basis of justice and righteousness the problems presented by the contrasts and evils of the present organization of society. So let's combat poverty, let's combat racism, let's combat things like slavery and other relics of barbarism. That's often the rhetoric that's being thrown around at this point in time, and that Judaism is primarily geared in the modern world to those kinds of activities. So this is the character of American Reform Judaism. But that draws some criticism, of course, from the Orthodox position. Now, I should say at the outset here, in talking about the Orthodox Jews in America, that this is, and has remained all the way to the present, a more diffuse movement, diffuse sect of Judaism, that Reform and conservative Judaism have had more of an organizational character, a centralization tendency in the United States. Not so with Orthodox Judaism. Now, as a result of this kind of movement toward what we might call a secular nature of Judaism, or Judaism as a religion, as a force for social justice, there are a number of secular Jewish organizations founded, lots of charity societies. The foremost of these is founded in 1843. It's called B'nai B'rith, which means children of the covenant, or sons of the covenant, to be more specific. And it functions as kind of like the Freemasons or the Odd Fellows Society, or eventually the Lions and Rotary Club. It's a kind of charitable organization, something that crusades for combating social ills, but it has a specifically Jewish character. And B'nai B'rith has been a force for good, not only in the United States, but all over the world ever since, right? So, trying to accomplish these goals that are laid out in the Pittsburgh platform and other things, but specifically as a kind of secular organization that happens to be have mostly Jewish members. Now, that's the nature of American Judaism all the way up to the 1880s, when there begins this massive influx, and we're talking in the millions of people, massive influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe. And this is spurred by the various persecutions which we talked about in Russia. The pogroms in 1881 are a kind of first bookend of this trend, and this is the last bookend would be the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which sets very strict immigration quotas and really stems the tide of Jewish immigration, reduces it to a trickle. But for that roughly 40 years, huge numbers of Jews immigrate from Eastern Europe, bringing with them their Orthodox traditional character, bringing with them the Jewish culture, the Yiddish language, all of these things of Eastern Europe. By 1924, by the time of the Johnson-Reed Act, there are 4.5 million Jews in the United States, and of course, some of these were still the Reform German based or German heritage Jews, but the largest number of them by this point are these Eastern European Ashkenazic Jews. They become laborers in large part, settling in the largest numbers in New York City, but immigrating to other, especially urban centers. Chicago comes to have a large Jewish community, as I said, Philadelphia, even Los Angeles in the late 19th and early 20th centuries comes to have a significant Jewish population. In fact, early Hollywood is spurred in large part by Jewish directors, Jewish producers. If you think about some of these early studios like Metro Goldwyn Mayer, Goldwyn and Mayer were both Jewish producers who founded that studio. And in any case, the entertainment industry, Jews really flourish in that in the United States. But the largest number of them work as laborers, especially in the garment industry, in the sweatshops of the Lower East Side of Manhattan and other places. And these garment factories, of course, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries have horrific conditions in them. If you think about some of the disasters, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. I forget, like I said, I'm not a historian of America. I forget what year that is exactly. But as a result of these terrible conditions, these Jews working in the garment industry end up becoming highly involved in the burgeoning unions and even in the various socialist organizations, Socialist Party of the United States. Some of them bring socialism, or I should say, communist tendencies with them from Russia. Given that they were involved, some of them were involved in that in protest of the Tsar's policies. But they gravitate more toward the labor unions instead of sort of full-blown communism in the United States. There is a robust Yiddish culture, newspapers, magazines, literature of various kinds, even Yiddish film in the United States. As I said in an earlier lecture, there's a kind of back and forth in the creation of Yiddish film between Poland and the United States, that there are even, film directors, Yiddish film directors who immigrate to America, but then go back to Poland and, sort of film between the two countries. The film adaptation of Tevye is made in the United States. I believe it's filmed on Long Island in the 1930s, but Yittelmitten Fiddle, which is another kind of landmark piece of Yiddish film, is actually filmed in Poland. And these are distributed in both the United States and Europe to large, adoring audiences of Jews who understand the language. Now, the German Jews, who were, of course, ensconced and the primary religious leadership up to this point, while they do make efforts to welcome these Eastern European Jews and even to campaign or lobby for them in government circles, to fight against the drive for immigration quotas and things like this, there is some tension between these communities. The reform and very acculturated character of Judaism with the German Jews is challenged by the more orthodox nature of these Eastern European Jews, and one of the things that becomes one of the kind of unintended consequences of that is that under the leadership of these German Jews, many of these there are lots of charitable organizations and even like social clubs founded by these Jewish organizations, and they cater to especially the young people, the children of these immigrants. And as a result of their very secular focus, many of these kind of second-generation Jews start to move away from the traditional religion, and then there's a worry about that to the point that Jews begin to, especially these Eastern European-based Russian and Polish Jews, begin to found religious organizations and religious institutions to draw back the younger generations, right? So there's this push and pull, and I mean, this, we can observe similar trends, I think, among immigrants of lots of different communities. This is the same period where there's a mass immigration of Italians, where there's a mass immigration of people from, Hungary and Poland who are not Jewish, and Russia who are not Jewish as well, and they're encountering similar sorts of challenges and founding similar kinds of institutions. So this is not only germane to a discussion of Judaism, but it certainly is one of the key themes of Jewish history in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so some of these Jewish institutions, the Jewish Theological Seminary. It starts just as a seminary in New York City and eventually becomes a kind of nationwide organization. One of the founding partners, really the first president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, was the chief rabbi of Philadelphia, Sabato Morias. By the way, the picture at the top left here is of Isaac Meyer Wise. The one on the right there, the guy in academic robes, is Solomon Schechter, who I'll talk about in just a moment here. But Sabato Morias was an Orthodox rabbi based in Philadelphia, but a kind of social reformer at the same time. He did not agree with Isaac Meyer Wise and with the Pittsburgh Platform. He continued to insist on an Orthodox reading of Judaism and kind of the persistence of the national character of the Jews and all of that. But he was also an outspoken opponent of slavery, a fierce abolitionist, one who did recognize the need for Jews to get involved in causes of social justice and things like this. And so the Jewish Theological Seminary is a kind of marriage of that emphasis within Judaism with the more orthodox kind of religious perspective, right? When Morias dies in 1897, the JTS then recruits Solomon Schechter, who had been a professor of Jewish theology at Cambridge University. They recruit him to come and take over the JTS. And they actually rebrand this then the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. And Solomon Schechter was an absolute intellectual giant. Under his leadership, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America becomes this really kind of key institution that fosters this blended version of Judaism. This is really the institution that leads to the growing popularity of what is called conservative Judaism. This, of course, was something that was kind of invented or imagined in Europe, but this becomes a perspective taken up by a lot of Jews, and there's a real centralizing tendency because of its association with the Jewish Theological Seminary. Conservative Judaism, under the leadership of Solomon Schechter and eventually the other leaders of the JTS, really retains this centralized character. And again, this is an attempt to kind of have it both ways, to have the Orthodox perspective, the traditional rituals to some extent, and especially this idea of the Jews as a unique people, as a people in general, not just as practitioners of a religion, but as a people, while still being interested in Judaism as a force for good in the broader society, specifically in American society, right? That's the version that Solomon Schechter champions. And Schechter himself is a great scholar of Judaism, an academic, and in addition to being a rabbi. And so his approach to Judaism is very scholarly, and conservative Judaism has retained in its rabbinical character very much a scholarly approach to this. Now, more diffuse is the Orthodox developments, and these Eastern European Jews become heavily involved in the fostering and the continuation of Orthodox Judaism. Not yet so many Hasidic Jews, but Orthodox rabbis coming from Eastern Europe, setting up synagogues and yeshivot in different places. Maybe the most important Orthodox institution in terms of its influence is Yeshiva University, which is founded, I forget the exact year, sometime 1890s or the first decade or so of the 20th century. I mean, the name itself is curious, right? This is a yeshiva, and so this is primarily for the training of rabbis in the study of Talmud, but it mixes in education in secular subjects to that, right? So Yeshiva University, this is in New York City. It is still a very fine research university, but also a university that continues to train rabbis in the Talmud, in the Orthodox tradition. Now, there are a number of other kind of quasi-governmental organizations, or rather organizations for the religious leadership in the United States. There are Zionist organizations, there are American branches of the World Zionist Organization, but many of these, especially the kind of German heritage Reform Jews, reject Zionism out of hand, given for reasons that should be obvious now, given our discussion of this. But these Eastern European Jews, many of whom had embraced Zionism as a cure for the ills that they encountered under Tsarist Russia, pushed for Zionist stances, and there's a kind of competition for leadership within these councils of rabbis. The most important of these that emerges in this period is called the American Jewish Congress, and this was an attempt to create a centralized religious leadership. And there's a conference that the Jewish Congress holds in 1918 where they push the rabbis from kind of Eastern European heritage push through a Zionist program. The AJC embraces the Zionist identity, but that will continue to be a debate in American Judaism. In fact, after the establishment of the State of Israel, and by the way, that's coincidental in time. In the next lecture, I'll talk about early Zionism. And, the Balfour Declaration is made in 1917. This is where the British government says that they're ready to support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. They then kind of walk back on that over the course of the next couple of decades. But the AJC is on top of all of that, and under the influence of these Eastern European rabbis, they embrace Zionism, whereas Reform Judaism retains, under its rather centralized leadership, retains this notion that the Judaism is a religion, and that the American Jews are American and they should not worry about returning to their former homeland or anything like that. The 1920s sees, of course, the period of the Red Scare after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and this produces a great deal of anti-Semitism because, of course, there are these huge numbers of Jews who have immigrated from Russia to the United States, many of them becoming involved in labor unions and socialist organizations. And so there's a fear that these Jews are a kind of red fifth column in the United States. This, of course, is also the period of the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. This is the Birth of a Nation's made in 1915, which spurs recruitment into the KKK. The KKK becomes active not just in the former Confederacy, but also in the North, and takes on not just a kind of racial character, which it had from its foundation in the Reconstruction period, but also overtly anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. Of course, it's also anti-Catholic and anti-foreigner in general. it's opposed to immigration from other places, right? So it takes this hard line, ultra nationalist, ultra right stance. It's also opposed as this poster of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, indicates, which itself is kind of a socialist organization. Uh, the or kind of the International Labor Union organization. This is noting that the KKK is anti-labor, right? Anti-labor unions, and we've got to fight against this menace, as it says, right? And so this becomes a threat, an anti-Semitic threat all over the country. I remember when I was a student at Notre Dame, someone explained the layout of the campus of the University of Notre Dame, that there's all of the main academic buildings are kind of in a conglomeration, and then there's a lot of open space around it. And as it was explained to me, and I don't know if this is entirely accurate, but they said they kept that open space because they feared, and this is northern Indiana, mind you, they feared that the KKK might attack the University of Notre Dame, and so they wanted to make sure that there were open fields that they could see them coming. They couldn't hide in the woods around the academic buildings. So I'm not sure that, so that's just to demonstrate the fear of the KKK that was happening in the 19-teens and 1920s. Well, there's a good deal of anti-Semitism spread by the KKK, and efforts to combat that. In 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, also called the Immigration Act, passes through Congress with little opposition, mind you. And this almost entirely halts the immigration from Eastern Europe, especially of Ashkenazic Jews. It does so by setting quotas, specifically that no national group can. The quotas are based on the percentage of. I've got to think about this. Okay, the percentage of those national communities according to the 1890 census. Now, they, of course, turned the clock back because they did not want to allow for continued immigration from places like Eastern Europe or Italy, or for that matter, Asia, China and Japan, right? This is another major target of the Johnson-Reed Act. And so, given that in 1890 there were not a lot of Eastern European Jews, there were not a lot of Italians, there were not a lot of Chinese in the United States, there are very strict quotas set on those, and rather generous quotas given to immigrants from Germany or from the UK or places like that, or Ireland even. And so this halts immigration almost entirely. And it can easily be said that there's a good deal of anti-Semitism that informs the Johnson-Reed Act, but it's also anti-Asian and anti-Italian, really kind of anti-Mediterranean in general too. And again, there's little opposition, even though there are Jews in positions of government. Louis Brandeis became a Supreme Court justice, of course, and others. This is not, there aren't enough Jews to kind of fight against the Johnson-Reed Act, and this becomes reality for the United States. At the same time, there are quotas set by educational institutions, even Ivy League universities like Harvard and Yale and Columbia set quotas on how many Jews will be admitted as students there. And there are some interesting results from this. Some institutions embrace Jewish students. City College in New York, in particular, churns out lots and lots of Jewish graduates. One Ivy League university does not participate in any Jewish quota. That's the University of Pennsylvania. And so Penn becomes called colloquially, at least by some, the Jewish Ivy. And that remains the case, really, for a long time, till probably the end of the 20th century. There's still this notion that Penn is the elite university that caters the most to the Jews. But there are quotas at Harvard and Yale and Columbia and these other places. There are quotas set for the number of Jews who were allowed to enter medical school. And all of this comes out of the kind of anti-Semitism that flourishes during the Red Scare. If anything, the anti-Semitism has stepped up during the Great Depression. Well, mostly because it's just a tense atmosphere. People are concerned. And they're worried about communism. They're worried about the unionists, that they're participating in communism. There's also a growing distrust, given realities in Central Europe, of people of German origin in this period. And where do the Jews come from? Well, they come from Russia and they come from Germany, right? So for those reasons, during the Great Depression period, and other reasons, there are lots of them, there's a good deal of anti-Semitism. One of the most popular radio programs in the United States in the 1930s was a weekly address given by a Detroit Catholic priest, Father Charles Coughlin, and he's pictured here on the slide. If you're interested in this, you can look him up on YouTube and hear some of the kind of hate-filled rhetoric that he spewed. One of the Usdin lectures recently, I think it was 2019, we had someone from Hebrew Union College come to Flagler and talk about the Jacob Rader Marcus Archive of American Judaism that is housed at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And among other things, they have all of these recordings of Charles Coughlin, and then those of a Jewish rabbi, and his name escapes me, I apologize for that, who also had a weekly radio program, and he had a back and forth with Charles Coughlin. Coughlin's an interesting character. He was not only fiercely anti-Semitic, but he was also he was initially a supporter of the New Deal and of FDR, but he later turned against him and sort of characterized FDR as a socialist, even as a communist, right? Coughlin later became I won't say an ardent supporter, but a fairly obvious supporter of fascism. There's even some evidence that he was involved in kind of indirect financial support of Hitler. Coughlin's a polarizing character in this period, but he is the chief representative of the kind of anti-Semitism that was brewing during the 1930s in the United States. Jews did embrace the New Deal. They tended to be strong supporters of Roosevelt, because this, gave everyone, I guess, opportunities, provided jobs on the basis of merit rather than imposing any religious test on people. The U.S. government became the largest employer in the United States, and it did not discriminate at all, at least it wasn't supposed to, on the basis of religion. And so FDR became the champion of the Jews, especially Eastern European Jews. For him, or rather for them, FDR was kind of their darling. With the rise of Nazism and FDR's rhetoric against the Nazis, the Jews became even more ardent supporters of the New Deal and of the Democrats. And that legacy has continued really until fairly recent times, when the kind of Jewish political situation in the United States has become more complicated. And we'll talk about that in a later lecture. Last point here before we end. With the rise of fascism in Europe, especially of the Nazis in Germany, there is a mass migration of Jewish intellectuals, and especially Jewish scientists, in the 1930s and 1940s. Some of them renowned scientists. Obviously, The foremost example of this is Albert Einstein, who was Jewish in heritage, though not necessarily in religious practice. It's these Jewish intellectuals who then, contribute in a multitude of ways to the scientific enterprise in the United States. Things like the Manhattan Project had a lot of these formerly German Jewish scientists working on the development of the atomic bomb. And so, this is definitely beneficial to the United States. Okay, that's it for this lecture. The next one will cover early Zionism, so you can look forward to that. Hope everyone's doing well, and I'll see you virtually next time. Thanks.